On a crisp morning in the summer of 1944, a German test pilot pushed a throttle lever forward a fraction of a second too quickly, and the two most advanced aircraft engines in the world promptly consumed themselves in a catastrophic pool of molten metal. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft, did not roar into existence as a perfected weapon of war. It clawed its way off the drawing board as a desperate engineering compromise, born from a volatile combination of immense aerodynamic genius and severe metallurgical starvation. Pilots stepping into its narrow cockpit were handed a machine capable of outrunning anything in the Allied arsenal by more than 100 miles per hour, yet they carried the terrifying knowledge that a heavy-handed throttle adjustment at the wrong altitude would instantly cause a violent compressor stall. This mechanical failure would spit a 30-foot tongue of fire from the exhaust, choke the engine of oxygen, and leave the pilot trapped in a 5-ton unpowered glider, drifting helplessly over a fiercely hostile combat zone. To understand why such a volatile and unpredictable machine was rushed directly from the testing grounds onto the active flight line, one must look at the grim strategic reality facing the Third Reich in 1943 and 1944. The daylight skies over Europe had become a relentless meat grinder for the Luftwaffe, with massive formations of American B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers darkening the horizon on a daily basis. These bomber streams were increasingly escorted by swarms of long-range fighters, completely neutralizing the traditional defensive tactics that had kept German airspace relatively secure earlier in the conflict. Germany was rapidly transitioning from a doctrine of lightning offensive conquest to one of panicked, deeply entrenched homeland defense, bleeding heavily through the loss of their most experienced veteran pilots and burning through their reserves of high-octane aviation fuel at an entirely unsustainable rate. Traditional piston engine interceptors like the Messerschmitt F-109 and the F-Wolf-190 were reaching the absolute physical limits of propeller-driven performance, burdened by the heavy steel armor plating and massive cannons required to bring down the heavily defended heavy bombers. The German High Command eventually realized that squeezing marginal incremental improvements in horsepower out of traditional piston engines would never break the back of the Allied daylight bombing campaign. They desperately needed a massive paradigm shift in high-altitude speed and interception capability that would render the vast American fighter escorts completely obsolete in a single stroke. If detailed breakdowns of aviation history and engineering interest you, subscribe. I've got more of these coming. The original requirement for a jet-powered fighter had actually predated this dire late-war situation with the initial development contracts, issued by the Aviation Ministry as early as 1938. However, bureaucratic apathy, constantly shifting political priorities, and a deeply entrenched lack of faith in unproven turbojet technology delayed the project for several crucial years, while the Reich enjoyed its early wartime successes. By the time the strategic pendulum violently swung in favor of the combined Allied forces, the German military apparatus scrambled frantically to accelerate the long-dormant Me-262 program to save their crumbling infrastructure. The designers were tasked with delivering an interceptor that could climb rapidly to 30,000 feet, sprint directly through the dense defensive screens of P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt escorts without ever being engaged, and tear apart the bomber streams before diving safely back to base. The resulting airframe was a radical departure from anything that had ever flown in atmospheric combat, characterized by a sleek, shark-like fuselage, a distinctively triangular tail section, and a pair of massive engine nacelles slung underneath the wings. One of the most immediately recognizable visual features of the Me-262 is its moderately swept wing, angled backward at exactly 18.5 degrees. But the origin of this revolutionary design was actually a serendipitous accident of engineering, rather than deliberate transonic aerodynamic planning. Messerschmitt's engineers originally drafted the airframe with a completely traditional straight wing, fully intending to mount early, highly compact jet engines flush within the thick wing roots near the fuselage. When the development of those specific lightweight engines completely failed, the design team was suddenly forced to adopt the much heavier and bulkier Junkers Jumo 004 engines, which had to be mounted further out on the wing structure. This sudden change in weight distribution violently threw the aircraft's center of gravity completely out of balance, threatening to make the plane aerodynamically unstable and completely uncontrollable in the air. To fix this severe balance issue without undertaking a massive and costly total redesign of the entire fuselage, the engineers simply swept the outer wing panels backward, manually shifting the aerodynamic center of pressure toward the rear to match the new, heavier engine weights. It was only later, during extensive high-speed wind tunnel testing, that the aerodynamicists realized this makeshift center of gravity fix significantly delayed the onset of compressible shock waves across the wing surface at extreme speeds. They had accidentally unlocked the fundamental secret to transonic flight, stumbling upon a swept-wing principle that would go on to shape high-speed military and commercial jet design for the next century. But the sheer genius of the swept wing was constantly held hostage by the bleeding-edge, deeply flawed propulsion system that generated the massive thrust required to push the heavy airframe through the sky. The mechanical heart of the aircraft consisted of two junkers, Jumo 004 axial flow turbojets, an engineering approach that differed completely from the centrifugal flow engines being developed simultaneously by the British engineers for their own jet programs. Axial flow engines functioned by passing incoming air straight through a long series of spinning compressor blades, creating a much smaller frontal area and drastically reducing aerodynamic drag compared to the fat, barrel-like centrifugal engines utilized by the Allies. However, this massive theoretical aerodynamic advantage carried a terrible bloody price tag, given the harsh manufacturing realities of late-war Germany. The Third Reich found itself critically short on the vital high-temperature metallic alloys like chromium and nickel, meaning the engine's combustion chambers and internal turbine blades had to be constructed from vastly inferior heat-resistant steel. This heavily compromised steel simply could not withstand the blistering inferno of continuous jet thrust, presenting a massive thermal challenge for the engineering teams attempting to make the aircraft combat ready. To keep these low-grade steel turbine blades from literally melting into liquid slag during continuous flight, engineers had to design them as complex hollow structures and actively bleed cooling air taken from the compressor stage straight through the hollow center of the blades. This was a brilliantly creative piece of improvisational engineering designed to circumvent a massive supply chain failure, yet it ultimately doomed the advanced engines to a horrifyingly short and unpredictable operational lifespan. A newly installed Jumo 004 engine was generally expected to last roughly 10 to 25 hours of total flight time before the intense heat stress caused the metal to creep, stretch out of shape, and inevitably shatter against the engine casing, destroying the expensive unit from the inside out. Mechanics working in the muddy fields were forced into a perpetual exhausting cycle of heavy engine swaps, using crude cranes to pull entire nacelles off the wings and replacing them with whatever spare units could be scavenged or delivered over a heavily bombed railway network. This intense, unrelenting maintenance burden meant that on any given day, more than 50% of the highly prized jet fleet was sitting uselessly on the tarmac, waiting for fresh engines, completely incapable of rising to meet the waves of incoming Allied bombers. Getting these volatile engines started was an entirely separate mechanical adventure, requiring a bizarre piece of nested technology that perfectly illustrated the era's transition between the piston and the jet age. Hidden deep inside the shiny metal nose cone of each massive jet engine was a small, two-stroke Riedel piston engine, essentially a modified high-performance motorcycle engine, which served as the mechanical starter for the main turbine. A ground crew mechanic had to walk up to the front of the jet, reach directly into the intake, and aggressively pull a metal ripcord attached to a handle to start the small piston engine, much like starting a modern lawnmower. Once the noisy two-stroke engine was screaming at high revolutions per minute, the pilot would engage a mechanical clutch that connected it to the main jet compressor, slowly spinning the heavy axial blades up to the critical speed required to introduce jet fuel and ignite the main combustion chambers. It was a loud, smoky, and highly dangerous ballet of analog machinery, completely devoid of the push-button electronic ignition systems that define modern military aviation. Step inside the narrow, unpressurized cockpit of the Me-262, and the technological whiplash of 1940s aviation becomes immediately apparent to anyone accustomed to modern digital flight decks. The pilot sat behind a massively thick piece of bullet-resistant armored glass, surrounded by a dizzying array of analog dials, completely unassisted by modern computers, hydraulic flight controls, or fly-by-wire computer safeguards. Flying this heavy machine required the delicate touch of a master surgeon, particularly when physically manipulating the fuel engine throttles during the heat of combat. Early jet engines entirely lacked automated fuel control systems, meaning that if a pilot slammed the throttle forward in a desperate attempt to escape an attacking P-38 Lightning, the mechanical pumps would dump raw aviation fuel into the combustion chamber, significantly faster than the spinning compressor could supply the necessary oxygen. The resulting rich mixture would instantly ignite in a massive thermal spike, either melting the fragile turbine blades into useless scrap or choking the engine into a violent stall that would abruptly rob the aircraft of all forward thrust. If the pilot managed to successfully coax the volatile engines up to a prime interception altitude of 26,000 feet, they found themselves wielding a weapons package specifically tailored to obliterate heavily armored four-engine bombers. The nose of the aircraft was densely packed with four 30mm Mk-108 heavy cannons, a tightly clustered battery of heavy artillery that provided unprecedented destructive power in air-to-air combat. A single 30mm high-explosive incendiary shell possessed enough explosive force to cleanly rip the wing off an enemy fighter. And it generally took only 4 or 5 well-placed hits to fatally cripple a massive B-17 flying fortress and send it spiraling toward the earth. Because the large jet engines were mounted completely out on the wings rather than sitting inside the nose like traditional fighter designs, the designers were able to group all 4 heavy cannons tightly together in the forward fuselage structure. This brilliant layout eliminated the complex problem of convergence angles that constantly plagued the wing-mounted machine guns on Allied fighters, providing the German pilot with a highly concentrated laser-like stream of devastating cannon fire directly along their line of sight. Yet, just like the compromised jet engines, this devastating offensive firepower came attached to a severe tactical limitation that the pilots had to overcome through sheer nerve and intense aggression. The Mk-108 cannon utilized an incredibly short barrel and suffered from a very low muzzle velocity, meaning the heavy 30mm high explosive shells lost their momentum rapidly and dropped like stones over long distances. To score reliable, lethal hits against an American bomber, the jet pilot had to close the physical distance to under 600 yards, screaming in from the rear at closing speeds that often exceeded 200 miles per hour faster than their target. This massive, unprecedented speed differential meant the attacking pilot had a tiny window of roughly 2 to 3 seconds of effective firing time before they had to violently break away to avoid physically ramming into the tail section of the American bomber. The margin for error was almost non-existent, requiring a dead steady hand on the control stick while navigating headfirst through the dense, terrifying crossfire of 50 caliber machine guns wielded by dozens of mutually supporting bomber turrets. Knowing what you now know about its historical performance, do you think this design approach was the right call for its era? Share your thoughts below. To circumvent this terrifying necessity of flying directly into the teeth of the American defensive fire, German engineers initiated another desperate loop of technological innovation by developing unguided air-to-air rockets. Later models of the jet were equipped with wooden racks located underneath the outer wings, carrying 24 unguided R-4M folding fin rockets. These solid fuel rockets could be ripple-fired into the tightly packed American bomber formations from distances well beyond the effective reach of the defensive machine guns, acting as a massive aerial shotgun blast. A single hit from an explosive rocket warhead was absolutely guaranteed to instantly destroy a heavy bomber, and this specific tactic proved incredibly lethal, foreshadowing the completely missile-centric aerial warfare doctrine that would come to dominate the skies during the Cold War decades later. However, the operational deployment and combat effectiveness of the Me-262 was severely hampered by one of the most heavily debated strategic blunders of the Second World War, dictated directly by High Command. Adolf Hitler, growing increasingly obsessed with seeking direct explosive retaliation against the Allied invasion forces landing in Europe, forcefully demanded that this revolutionary high-altitude interceptor be heavily modified into a fast fighter bomber. He envisioned fleets of what he called the Schnellbomber, dropping heavy ordnance directly onto the beaches of Normandy, entirely ignoring the aerodynamic realities of the machine his engineers had actually built. The sleek airframe was entirely unsuited for this specific ground attack role. It severely lacked the dive brakes necessary to control bombing runs. Its blistering high speed made precision targeting practically impossible, and carrying heavy bombs externally under the fuselage completely negated the aerodynamic speed advantages that kept it safe from Allied fighter patrols. This massive political interference delayed the vital formation of dedicated jet fighter interceptor squadrons for several crucial months, squandering the tiny window of opportunity where the jet could have operated in significant numbers before the Allied air forces achieved absolute total air supremacy over the European continent. When dedicated elite fighter units finally brought the pure interceptor version of the jet into regular combat operations in late 1944, the psychological shock delivered to the Allied bomber crews was truly profound. American escort pilots flying the formidable, highly capable P-51 Mustang suddenly found themselves trying to engage a hostile target they simply could not catch in a straight line, nor could they match its phenomenal climbing ability. Veteran American pilots quickly learned that violently diving from a higher altitude to artificially build up kinetic energy was their only realistic hope of closing the distance to the German jet. But even with that massive energy advantage, the jet pilot could simply open the throttle carefully and rapidly walk away from the engagement. The sheer speed of the jet heavily disrupted the standard, highly rehearsed defensive tactics of the massive bomber boxes. Turret gunners, who had been extensively trained to lead piston-engine fighters moving at a predictable 300 miles per hour, consistently fired their defensive bursts harmlessly behind the jets, completely unable to adapt to an adversary slashing violently through their formation at well over 500 miles per hour. But real-world air combat is rarely a perfectly clean laboratory experiment determined strictly by top speeds and calculated turn radiuses, and the combined Allied forces soon discovered the formidable jet's fatal Achilles heel lay deeply embedded in the very physics of early jet propulsion. First-generation jet engines are incredibly slow to accelerate from low revolutions per minute, meaning the heavy ME-262 was incredibly sluggish, highly unresponsive to control inputs, and intensely vulnerable during the crucial phases of takeoff and landing. Allied fighter pilots, recognizing they could not safely catch the jet at high combat altitudes, quickly adopted highly ruthless rat-catcher tactics, intentionally lingering in the skies just outside the perimeters of known German air bases. When a returning jet lowered its heavy landing gear and deployed its large flaps to slow down to approach the concrete runway, running dangerously low on fuel and completely out of cannon ammunition, the Allied fighters would brutally swoop down from the clouds and easily destroy them in their most defenseless state. The tactical situation eventually became so desperate that the heavily depleted Luftwaffe had to permanently assign specialized squadrons of F-Wolf 190 piston fighters solely to circle low over their own airfields, creating a protective umbrella of anti-aircraft fire simply to protect the highly vulnerable jets as they slowly gained speed on takeoff or limped home to land. To properly place the German jet firmly in its correct historical context, one must draw a direct comparison to its only true operational contemporary of the era, the heavily utilized British Gloucester Meteor. While the British twin-engine Meteor achieved operational squadron status at roughly the exact same time late in the war, it represented a fundamentally completely different philosophy in aeronautical engineering and pilot safety. The British aircraft strictly relied on highly robust, heavily tested centrifugal flow engines that were vastly more reliable in daily operation and certainly did not catastrophically melt themselves after a mere 10 hours of standard flight. This reliable engineering choice afforded the Royal Air Force pilots a massive margin of operational safety and confidence that their desperate German counterparts could only dream of possessing. However, the Meteor's traditional straight wings and significantly bulkier, drag-inducing engine nacelles meant it severely lacked the blistering transonic top speed and the high-altitude intercept capability of the radically designed German machine. The Gloucester Meteor was a highly solid, incredibly dependable first cautious step into the dawning jet age, whereas the ME-262 was a brilliant, highly volatile, and dangerously reckless leap directly into the next generation of advanced fighter design, paying dearly for its wildly superior aerodynamic performance with absolutely devastating mechanical unreliability. The brutal human cost of continuously operating this advanced machinery was staggering, even for the most highly decorated and experienced veteran pilots remaining in the German military. Legendary fighter aces like Walter Nowotny, who had miraculously survived years of brutal grinding combat against massive waves of aircraft on the Eastern Front, ultimately lost their lives not strictly to enemy action, but directly to the inherent dangers of the temperamental airframe they were forced to fly. Spontaneous engine fires in midair, terrifying landing gear collapses at high speeds on rough terrain, and catastrophic compressor stalls over hostile territory claimed almost as many valuable airframes as the millions of Allied 50 caliber bullets filling the skies. The remaining German pilots were pushed far beyond the absolute brink of extreme physical and mental exhaustion, forced into flying from heavily bombed out military airfields, carefully navigating around massive, hastily filled bomb craters on the runway just to achieve takeoff speed. They were entirely reliant upon a deeply shattered logistics chain that literally had to transport highly volatile jet aviation fuel hidden inside wooden barrels pulled by slow horse-drawn carts, simply because the national railway networks had been systematically pulverized by the endless heavy bomber raids. Because the heavy, underpowered jets required meticulously paved, incredibly long concrete runways to safely build up sufficient takeoff speed, their operational bases were highly visible from the air. As the Allied ground forces relentlessly advanced across the continent, these pristine, unbroken airfields became incredibly rare, forcing the remaining battered jet squadrons to operate directly from perfectly straight sections of the civilian Autobahn highways that had been heavily camouflaged with green paint and hidden deep within the dense pine forests. Despite its absolutely undeniable technological superiority in the air, the overall strategic impact of the jet fighter on the final outcome of the global war was practically negligible in the grand scheme of the conflict. The vast manufacturing production facilities had to be heavily decentralized and physically hidden deep inside damp caves or carved into mountainsides to successfully avoid the relentless Allied area bombing campaigns, which resulted in massive, crippling quality control issues across the entire supply chain. Vital mechanical components, manufactured by completely different makeshift factories in different regions, often heavily failed to fit together properly when they finally reached the hidden final assembly lines. Furthermore, the brutalized forced slave labor, completely coerced into building many of these vital technical parts, frequently engaged in highly courageous, quiet, and absolutely desperate acts of industrial sabotage, intentionally creating microscopic flaws in the engine turbines that would cause them to fail in flight. Out of an impressive paper total of over 1,400 individual airframes successfully constructed by the end of the conflict, far less than 300 fully functional jets ever saw actual aerial combat at any single time. They managed to successfully shoot down an estimated 500 combined Allied aircraft, which represents a terrifying localized tactical success, but essentially amounts to a mere drop in the ocean. Compared to the tens of thousands of replacement planes, the combined Allies were effortlessly churning out of completely untouchable, brightly lit factories in Michigan and California every single month of the year. As the chaotic final days of the brutal conflict finally played out in the muddy spring of 1945, the Me-262 rapidly transitioned from a terrifying weapon of desperate national defense into the absolute most highly prized piece of technological bounty on the entire planet. Both leading American and deeply motivated Soviet military intelligence forces aggressively scrambled across the smoking ruins of the fallen Third Reich, urgently launching highly covert military operations specifically designed to capture completely intact jet airframes, massive caches of spare parts, and the surviving brilliant engineers who actually designed and built them. The victorious global superpower nations quickly realized that the vast wealth of aerodynamic data directly gleaned from studying the swept-wing aerodynamics and the hollow-blade axial flow engines would completely and permanently reset the future global balance of aerial power. Highly skilled American aeronautical engineers extensively reverse-engineered and flight-tested, heavily guarded, captured models at Wright Field in Ohio, fundamentally shifting their own domestic fighter programs towards swept-wing designs. Simultaneously, the sprawling Soviet Union aggressively reverse-engineered the captured Junkers axial flow engines to immediately power their own highly ambitious first-generation jet fighter development programs, ensuring that the heavy DNA of this volatile German interceptor was instantly and permanently woven deeply into the fabric of the looming, decades-long Cold War. Today, forming a proper, completely objective historical assessment of this revolutionary and deadly machine firmly requires meticulously separating the heavily romanticized post-war mythology of the ultimate invincible wonder weapon from the stark, greasy, and deeply flawed reality of its actual daily operational existence. It was absolutely not a flawless, war-winning miracle machine that was magically held back solely by a few isolated political mistakes made by high command. Rather, it was a highly experimental, drastically unfinished prototype, forcefully shoved into brutal full-scale combat operations years before its underlying complex technology was truly mature enough to survive the battlefield. The advanced metallurgical science strictly required to actually make its revolutionary high-temperature engines reliable and safe simply did not mathematically exist in Germany at that precise time in history. Yet, looking critically past the deeply horrific and evil political regime it faithfully served, the permanent engineering legacy of the sleek aircraft remains absolutely undeniable and profoundly transformative to the entire field of human aviation. Every single time you board a massive modern commercial airliner, powered by highly efficient jet engines slung cleanly underneath massive swept-back wings, you're directly experiencing the incredibly refined, aerodynamic descendants of a deeply desperate design choice originally made simply to fix a severe center of gravity weight problem in the middle of 1942. The world's first operational combat jet aggressively arrived at the chaotic intersection of absolutely brilliant theoretical innovation and entirely insurmountable logistical and industrial collapse. It deeply terrified the brave Allied heavy bomber crews who were suddenly forced to face it in the freezing skies, heavily frustrated the exhausted German pilots who desperately fought to keep its volatile engines from violently melting themselves in midair, and completely rewrote the fundamental engineering rulebook for high-speed atmospheric flight forever. It physically proved once and for all that the mysterious, deeply feared sound barrier was absolutely not an unbreakable physical wall in the sky, but merely the exciting next frontier of aviation, provided future engineers could eventually figure out exactly how to keep the metal engine components from violently burning up in the complex process. The long, dominant era of the mighty spinning propeller had been violently and permanently closed, not by a safely perfected, perfectly reliable weapon of war, but by a deeply flawed, highly dangerous mechanical pioneer that quite literally set the open sky on fire. If you found this historical analysis useful, a like helps more people discover these deep dives. Thanks for watching.